Hello and welcome to the University of Ontario Debate Society Introduction to Debate series. We are now going to be moving into our second module. In the previous module, we discussed formal debate at a very surface level and discussed what are the different elements that it is composed of. Now we're going to be moving into discussing those different elements, first starting with motions. So without further ado, let's begin. Debate motions. A motion, also known as a proposition or resolution, is a statement that sets the topic for the given debate and usually includes some kind of change. If you think about this in the real world, this makes sense. A lot of the things that we disagree about are about different actions people take. For example, whether a parent is treating their kid right or whether they ought to be treating their kid in that way. For example, tiger parenting, or whether the government should pass some kind of policy, for example, increasing taxes or decreasing taxes. These are all some kind of action or change that we typically deliberate. Things that are not some kind of change would maybe be discussing who the greatest president is, because that doesn't require some kind of change, but we could still debate this. Motions cover a diverse range of topics and can come in many forms and require you to approach them slightly differently. This is going to be a bulk focus of our seminar today. We're going to be discussing a lot in depth as to how you could approach these different topics. Below is a non-exhaustive list of topic areas common in debate. And do not worry, the topics are designed to be engaging and accessible to all debaters. So although you might know more about one specific topic area, that should not preclude you from being able to participate in debate. The topics are designed explicitly to be accessible to everyone. So what are these different topic areas you may or may not cover? 1, politics. 2, economics. 3, philosophy. 4, sports. 5, religion. 6, social justice. 7, culture. 8, international relations. And 9, art. Again, there are topic areas beyond these listed ones. For example, science, not in a very specific level, but more like in an ethics level that you might encounter as well. Modifiers and responsibilities. Debaters are tasked with delivering arguments for their side of the motion. Besides the topic of the motion, each motion has a modifier in the form of an acronym, such as THW, which stands for this house would, and this house believes that. That stands for this house believes, THBT, that stands for this house believes that. The modifier establishes what teams have to defend and what arguments are deemed legitimate or not. What this necessarily means is that understanding these types of modifiers in front of the topics becomes incredibly important in finding success in debate. It is kind of just a learning curve, and as soon as you understand how to approach each of these different modifiers, it becomes a very minute aspect of the debate. On government, then, you are in favor of the motion that usually argues for some kind of change, and on opposition, you're usually against the motion and against the change, or sometimes you propose for an alternative change. I'll explain where that is applicable and where not applicable in subsequent slides. So how do you approach a motion? How do you set it up? This is assuming you've never done debate. This is even before you understand how to debate. How is it that you're supposed to conceptualize emotions so you know how to create arguments out of it? The following 3 easy steps can be described as the setting up stage to approaching a motion. This is done prior to brainstorming arguments, strategy, etc., in order to avoid simple mistakes that come with having a poor understanding of emotion. So again, it's really important before doing anything, before trying to think of arguments for either side of a debate motion, to have a good fundamental grasp on what the motion is and what you have to defend. So what are the 3 steps that we take to set this motion up or set a motion up? Firstly, identify the type of motion. As I mentioned earlier, some motions require specific considerations and approaches depending on the modifier / type of motion. Again, it could be THW, THR, THBT, THO, and also based on its content. Secondly, you want to clarify the basic terms of the motion. Consider every word of the motion and the implications it might have on the debate. For example, this house would aggressively redistribute X is different than saying you would just redistribute X, because the adjective implies a lot more serious obligation in terms of what government has to defend. That it's not just a minute amount of redistribution, but that it really is involving a pretty probably large sum of resources being redistributed. And the same way that this House would strongly condemn X, will not just say that it's a light condemnation, but probably one that incurs maybe more actions, more severing of ties, etc. Thirdly, identify what both sides have to defend. Debating is about comparing. For example, whether you should do something or whether you should not do something. So it is really important to have a conception of both what you and your adversary have to defend in order to know how to design your arguments and to tailor arguments against your opposition or your adversary. So what are these types of motions that we've been talking about in this first step where you have to identify the modifier and type of motion? There are common features among the different motion modifiers and types, which actually makes your life a lot easier because you don't have to memorize every single one, but broadly, you just have to know how to approach every single motion bucket. There are three buckets of motions to be concerned about. One, policy motions, two, analysis motions, and three, actors motions. In policy motions, we have this House would. In analysis motions, we have this House supports, this House believes that, this House regrets, and this House prefers. And in actor motions, we have this House as a would. The best way to conceptualize these buckets is as different chessboards. So it's not like you're going to be playing the same chessboard with exact same rules, limitations, and expectations every single time, but rather these motions provide you a different type of game, a different type of chessboard. So you just have to understand how you're supposed to approach them differently. You're still playing chess at the end of the day. You're still debating. It's only going to create some differences, but these differences matter enough for you to be aware of them. So let's go a little bit more into these motion buckets and what they mean. What is this policy motion bucket, or what is this analysis motion? Policy motions involve a policy, which is a concrete course of action that government teams wish to convince judges should be implemented right now, unless stated otherwise. For example, this House would ban guns. In this motion, we could clearly see that there is some kind of practical policy that requires some steps to implement, and after being implemented, would have some kind of consequences. Secondly, we have analysis motions, which involves a judgment that government teams wish to convince judges is true. So, for example, this House regrets the mass deregulation of the financial sector. You are trying to prove to the judges that this judgment, this emotion, this feeling about this topic is something that people should feel and it's right, it is correct, that it is true, that the mass deregulation of the financial sector has actually been something that people on average would regret. Lastly, actor motions involve teams taking the perspective of a certain entity, for example, a group, person, or country, to convince a judge whether the entity should take a certain course of action. So it's like a policy motion, except now we're taking the perspective of a specific entity, whether it's a person, country, or group. For example, this House, as the United States, would embargo Russia. As you can see, the actor that we are looking through the lens of is the United States or the entity, and so now we're debating from their perspective. The subsequent slides are going to go more in depth into each of these buckets and how you're supposed to approach them and what are those quirks that I was discussing. I would follow because these approaches will allow you to have a much better grasp of how to do well in debating, and it will ensure that you're not going to suffer from any of the beginner level mistakes that you might have with motions. So firstly, we're going to examine policy motions in depth. Motions of the form "this House would do X" involve teams arguing whether the House should enact policy X right now, with governments for and opposition against. A policy, as mentioned earlier, is a concrete course of action the government teams wish to convince judges should be implemented in order to ideally solve some kind of problem. That's typically why policies exist, and that's why we deliberate them. For instance, banning guns or making masks mandatory in the case of a pandemic is a type of policy that is used to address some kind of issue. Banning guns may be to rampant violence, or making masks mandatory in the case of pandemic for public health reasons. The government team needs to clarify then who is implementing the policy, or in other words, who is this house that we keep on referring to? This house would do something, but who is this house? And how is it going to be implemented so it's clear what is being debated? These two steps are otherwise known as a model. The reason why government is the one that needs to do this is because they're the ones that are technically bringing up the topic. They're the ones that are bringing up the motion. It's similar to, for example, how in Parliament, when the government brings up some kind of new law, they're the ones that have to clarify the terms of the law and how it works and stuff like that. And then the opposition then will be the one that's going to scrutinize it and attack certain points of it or be totally against it. But again, it's up to the government team to clarify the terms of the debate so it does not become incredibly messy and so that it is clear exactly what sides are both obligated to argue. The House, otherwise also known as the implementer, and this is pretty easy to conceptualize because if this House would do something, then this House is the person or group that is implementing whatever action it is. For instance, this House would ban guns. This House is the one implementing it. It is typically some kind of authoritative body, whether it's a government, politicians, etc., that could feasibly implement the policy or has the power and authority to do so. For instance, it could be every country in the world in some contexts. It could be United Nations. It could only be Western liberal democracies. It could be a specific country like Canada, etc. It is important to note that you ought not set the implementer as the world in every situation, because there will be some cases where it just will not make sense because it would never happen in the real world. And although it is the case that you can model some things if the motion requires you, that it won't be necessary or realistic. For example, this house would establish a one world government. Obviously, that's not something that happened in real life, but you still have to accept that all countries in the world would unite to create this for the purpose of debate to discuss whether this is something that's desirable, even if it's not feasible. The same idea goes here, where, for example, if the motion was this House would allow all press to be free, it wouldn't be fair to set this as every country in the world because it would presumably not happen in some countries. For instance, in Russia or China, where the media is moderated and regulated by the state and they have direct incentives to do so, it wouldn't really make sense for government to be able to model it there and say that arbitrarily they would, even if it's against their own very interests at a very fundamental level to do so, and it would never happen. And even if they did model it in that way, an easy response could be that even if there is free press, they're going to find different ways to undercut their ability to do it freely, and there's nothing that the free press could do about it. While explaining how it would be implemented, one could consider where the policy is being implemented, who the policy affects, and additional parameters. For instance, will this policy require an oversight body, opt in, opt out for certain people, etc. Just give a small conception of what would this look like if it were actually implemented, assuming we had the resources to do so, which is what we are assuming so. I believe that the most important aspect of the additional parameters is to get rid of specific arguments that you know would make the debate unfair. For instance, in the motion, this House would legalize prostitution. It would probably make sense to have an additional parameter of an age requirement, because to the point that there is no parameter for that, you're going to be taking a way bigger pill in a government to try to protect and defend legalizing prostitution in all instances, even with minors, than if you were to say the realistic and probably the main idea of why we would want to legalize prostitution would not be in those instances, but it would be in the other instances, for example, for consenting adults. So making sure that you consider additional parameters, not to necessarily make it tough for the opposition to win or to have any arguments, but rather to deal with any extraneous argument that you know are going to be done in bad faith and are definitely not what we would ask you to defend in a motion. It should be assumed that the policy will be implemented in the manner described by government, and this is known as fiat power. Basically, it's this idea that government has some power to establish how the policy is going to be implemented in policy motions, which means that the debate should never end up being whether the real world counterparts would or not implement such as policy. For instance, the United Nations would never do that. They would never do some kind of policy like that. That's not possible. That's not what the debate's about. When we have a topic, we're assuming it is possible by virtue of us debating it. The question again becomes whether it's something we'd want to happen, not whether it could happen. Lastly, the model should not be super specific. You don't need to include specific timelines, costs, etc. And it definitely should not be unfair. And this idea that I was referring to earlier, where you should not try to model it and add additional parameters to get rid of the adversary's arguments, this is known as squirreling. This is when you intentionally try to describe or set up the debate in a way that makes it harder for the other team to win deliberately. So it should only be there to provide clarity and to make sure that everyone knows what they're debating about. So under the policy motions, we also have this unique thing called counter models. For policy motions, opposition teams may either choose, if not given an alternative by the motion, to at least defend the status quo. Status quo is known as what's happening right now. It is our world as is. So, for instance, if we had the motion, this house would ban guns, then alternatively, opposition would probably be defending at very minimum, not doing anything. So, not banning guns. Another thing they could do is they could bring up a proposed alternative, and this is known as a counter model. But again, they do not have to do this. Opposition does not have to do this. They have the option to do this. It seeks to show that the solution offered by the government is not the most effective way to solve the problem at stake in the debate. Opposition's counter model should not take significantly more resources to achieve than the motion, and should be exclusive to the action proposed to the motion, which means that government and opposition, they are not going to have an opposition that's just going to come up and provide a counter model of just a good version of what government said. For instance, if it was this house would ban guns, they can't just go and counter model and say this house would ban guns, but properly. We're going to do it the right way. That doesn't really make sense. Government could support both of those things at the same time. So it has to be something that cannot occur simultaneously with what the government motion is. And it also should not take significantly more resources to achieve than the motion. So if the motion was this house would give everyone $1,000, opposition can't come up here and say instead let's give everyone $2,000 because then they'd be using a lot more resources to solve or address the issue that the motion is trying to address than government has power to defend. And also, presumably, government would also defend that. They would just say, okay, we agree that there could be a better way. And if we had more resources like those ones, then it's not really exclusive to us. So this means that opposition must analyze why implementing the motion would harm the ability to implement the counter model. It's really easy. As long as you're able to explain that the motion, if implemented, makes it harder for you to get the counter model. For example, if there's like a limited amount of financial resources that you have, and therefore allocating them to the model and what the motion makes it cost to the counter model, that is a valid way to analyze things. This also makes logical sense to have a counter model because policies, they do take financial, political, and or social resources to implement. So if opposition argues against those resources for a government's policy, they could argue to use it elsewhere that might be more effective. You could be against something because you think there's just a better way to do it that is exclusive to the way that the other team presented it. For instance, a counter model to increasing taxes would be decreasing taxes potentially, right? Because those two things cannot occur simultaneously. Or a counter model to providing cash transfers for welfare could be providing in-kind services or in-kind transfers instead. Cash transfer for welfare being, for example, if you're under a certain bracket in terms of income, that means that you get money directly transferred to you they could spend, and in-kind transfers is if you're under a certain income or in poverty, then you instead go to places to collect things like food stamps, clothing, etc. These things are also technically different to each other because although both could exist simultaneously, the motion says this house would have all welfare be cash transfers, then presumably in opposition, you could say, well, we don't support that because we think that there's a better way to redistribute goods for people, and that is in-kind transfers. Given that counter models exist, government teams may have to not just explain why doing a policy is better than nothing, which is again the natural state of what opposition has to defend in this House would motions. So, for example, if there's a policy this House would ban zoos, then opposition would just defend not banning zoos and doing nothing. But that's just their base state. They could also, again, provide a counter model and explain why doing their policy in their counter model is better than pursuing the other policies. So now we're going to do a quick activity on modeling and counter modeling. For subsequent activities, how it's going to work is I am going to present the activity or the information relevant to it. Then after that, I will pause the video 10 seconds to allow you to try to address it and solve it. And assuming that if you don't want to, you could skip through it. But if you do, then you'll be able to see the answers as I describe them. So let's begin with modeling and counter modeling, where you're going to practice doing these two things. So firstly, this house legalized child labor. I'll give you 10 seconds. All right. So the implementer here probably makes sense for it to be developing countries, because in the instance of developed countries, it probably is not applicable to have child labor, since the issues in terms of child poverty rate is not nearly as high, and there's a lot more social security and resources to address those issues. This probably makes sense in countries where you just do not have those same structures, you do not have the same family structures, same security structures, etc. So who would this apply to? Individuals under the age of 18 who are able and willing to work. So note how if you do not model that, you could always clarify it later, but you're just giving an opening for opposition to say it's going to be forced or it's going to be similar to exploitative child labor. You probably want to explicitly differentiate it from the get-go and say that it's about those who are able and willing to work, similarly to employment structures that we have right now. And additional parameters, maybe talk about some safety rules and benefits for any employee and say how they apply to children as well, and how increased regulation will occur to ensure that children are not being forced in labor. Again, a key note is that you can't model and say that this is never going to happen. What you could probably say is reasonably, if we are going to legalize child labor, there's probably going to be higher standards and more resources invested in ensuring that there's not going to be exploitative actions against this specific population. Although, again, opposition still has the grounds to argue that it will happen anyways, maybe worse, maybe not. Second motion, this house would heavily fund space colonization efforts. For this one, consider models and counter models. All right. So the implementer in this context is governments and their respective space programs. They're the ones that would heavily fund space colonization efforts, maybe corporations as well. Some additional parameters you might want to include here is that people will be selected on many parameters, such as random for paid meritocracy. So basically those that get sent for space colonization efforts, it's not going to be just the rich people. It's going to include a lot of variety of individuals. So a counter models they could propose to this potentially is one, spend money on making Earth much more habitable. Presumably you could defund these efforts for space colonization because money is the one thing that is zero sum. If I spend one tax dollar in one place, I'm not gonna be able to spend it in another place. And I can't print infinite amount of money. There's gonna be a case where I would want to spend more money in one place and more in another. So you could argue that it is exclusive and then say that you'd rather spend money making Earth much more habitable than trying to escape, which is presumably what space colonization is for. Two, you could fund space resource extraction instead of colonization, saying colonization again is a waste, but I think extraction probably has a similar approach to this idea of making Earth much more habitable. And lastly, again, this kind of explains the idea that it is exclusive because funds are zero sum. The government does not have an infinite money glitch. They can technically print a lot of money, but even if they print more money, you could technically still allocate more of that money into these other efforts instead of funding space colonization. So even at a proportion level, it will always exist the case that on government, you are heavily funding space colonization efforts, and on opposition, you could choose to do anything else with that money. All right, so that broadly summarizes everything that we've learned about this house wood motions. We're now going to move into analysis motions, which is the second bucket of motions, and largely a little bit of more of the confusing one. Unlike policy motions, there are many variations of analysis motions, both in form and requirements. You have this house believes that X, this house supports X, this house opposes X, this house prefers X, and this house regrets X. So as you could see, it is pretty clear that there is a lot of different ways at which this motion or this type of motion bucket could appear. But again, as I mentioned earlier, a motion bucket implies that they are similar in like general broad approach, which means that you should apply that same knowledge that we learned for analysis motions for all of them. But again, there will be more specifics about how to approach each one. Since analysis motions are about whether judgment on a topic are about a judgment on a topic, for instance, supporting something, preferring something, regretting something, and about it being true, the House is always going to be the average informed person that broadly cares about all issues, right? Because a policy is implemented by some kind of authoritative body, but a judgment is something that occurs in our head. So you don't actually have to model the House in these cases because presumably you're just trying to convince someone that they should support or regret something or oppose something, right? So it's about what exists in someone's head and that they should be convinced about it, the average informed person, as opposed to it being a specific authoritative body implementing it. So it being implemented is basically someone being convinced of this and agreeing with you. So again, the government's defending that the average person should accept the judgment as true, while the opposition is defending that the average person should accept the judgment as false. Besides the variations in modifiers, policy motions have several types of frameworks. There's fact, which is a motion about whether something is or is not true. This motion calls for factual interpretation. For example, this House believes that advertising has done more harm than good for society. In this instance, you're just trying to factually interpret what has advertising done and whether, if however you define harm and good, how on net how has it done. Note how this is a perfect example of a motion that does not have a change. Believing that advertising has done more harm than good does not require government to defend that we should live in a world without advertising or we should ban advertising. It is just a matter of interpreting whether it's done more harm than good. Government could just claim that it was inevitable and that we don't need to discuss that matter of debate. Value debates is whether something is or is not of inherent value. The motion calls teams to identify the value term and then develop a criteria to achieve the term and then compare. For example, this House believes that LeBron James is a greater basketball player than Michael Jordan. In this case, you'd have to identify the value term, greater basketball player, and then explain what are the conditions that make someone great. And again, same thing in value motions. These are the two, fact and value will be the two types of analysis motions that will not have a change or some kind of policy or anything like that. They're just about interpretation and they're not requiring any type of adjustment in that way. Just because you believe LeBron James is a great basketball player than Michael Jordan does not mean you have to ban Michael Jordan or regret that he existed or something like that. It's just a matter of fact. Do you agree with this or not? Lastly, hypothetical. This is similar to policy motions, but you'll start to notice a difference as we go in the upcoming slides. In hypothetical motions, it says something should or should not be changed, but the motion calls for an imagined world, whereas that change already exists in the first place, and there's no need to implement. There's no need for a model for implementation, only model for clarification. For example, this House prefers a world of superheroes. As you could clearly see, just because you believe that you prefer a world of superheroes does not mean you have to prove on government how we're going to get to that world, how we're going to get some kind of new technologies to have superheroes or some kind of like transition to that world. None of this is required. All you have to do is just imagine on government a world of superheroes, and on opposition, you're just defending the world as is. I'm now going to be explaining the idea of counterfactual, which is like a specific idea that is really important to analysis motions in the same way that counter models are really important in terms of the discussion of this House-Wood motions. In a hypothetical analysis motion, there is no implementation of a policy to get the change proposed by the motion. Instead of implementing a policy, debaters try to imagine a world where the motion is true or untrue and whether it is desirable, kind of like an alternative timeline. I like to think of it as like a multiverse. So you're imagining a world where we had superheroes and trying to place superheroes in the current context of the way we understand things, as opposed to trying to explain how we get there. For example, in this House would ban zoos, you're trying to explain how we get to banning zoos. You do not need to do that here. This is also known as a counterfactual, the alternative timeline, in the same way status quo means right now. In debate land, counterfactual means the alternative timeline in whatever debate you're referring to. So it is defined as a world that did not happen or is currently not the case. Teams do not need to describe implementation, but rather they need to argue what this imaginary alternate counterfactual world would be likely to look like if the motion were true. So again, no implementation. I keep on hammering this, but both teams have the right to argue about what it would look like, what this world will come across as. Notably, what the imaginary alternate counterfactual world look like is up for debate. So government does not have the same fiat power to say, like in, for example, this house prefers a world with superheroes, that all these superheroes are going to be good and not going to be bad, right? It is up for debate for us to analyze whether it's likely that if we were to have superheroes in our world, whether they'd be good only or bad. And more or less likely, it's reasonable to assume you're going to have some people that are going to use their superheroes bad because people use the tools they have in good and bad ways, depending on their incentives. So it's reasonable to assume that if they just had superhero powers, they would probably just use that as another tool at their disposal to get whatever they want, either through a good way or through a bad way. Some key advice then is when a team is defending a world absent of something that already happened in status quo, they're also defending a world whereas something else fills in the void. So this idea, for example, if it was this house regrets the rise of cryptocurrency, then you need to argue and explain what would fill that void. If the counterfactual is a world without the rise of cryptocurrency, which notably, the opposition is defending status quo. We've already had the rise of cryptocurrency. It's already had a lot of adoption, boom, etc. Then realistically, you're going to have to not only explain why the rise of cryptocurrency is bad, but why a world without the rise of cryptocurrency is good. So what happens in this world? What is the alternative that comes up? This is incredibly important in this House regrets motions because this is the most common mistake government teams make and why a lot of them end up losing in that specific type of motion. Teams cannot argue that the hypothetical would never happen, since the motion is not about whether it could happen, but whether we prefer to have happen. For example, you can't just say, oh, there's no such thing as superheroes, that would never happen, because we're not arguing that. We're arguing whether it would be cool if we had a world, or whether it'd be better if we had a world where there were superheroes. In analysis motions, counter models are not permitted as there are no resources being expended in judgment, right? You are not expending any resources by agreeing with the statement this house regrets the rise of cryptocurrency. You are expending resources by saying this house would ban zoos because you need political, financial, and social resources to get that across. So the opposition is either then given an alternative or must defend the world as is. And that's about it. They can't bring up an alternative. You can't be like, oh, we prefer a world where there are good superheroes as an alternative to a world with superheroes. You do not have that right. So don't try a counter model in analysis motions. This does not exist. You do not do that. For instance, in the motion, this house supports the rise of social media. The opposition cannot say we support the rise of good social media instead of as a counter model, again, because the government could also simultaneously support the rise of all social media, and good social media is included in that. All right, we're now moving on to our second activity, and we're going to apply the same approach to it that we did to the other one, where I'm going to show you the prompt or the activity, and then you are going to have 10 seconds to prepare. We're going to take it up. So in this one, you're going to identify the counterfactual in each of these cases, including this household motions as well, I'm pretty sure. Or maybe not, I'm not sure. All right, so this house prefers a world without organized religion. You have 10 seconds. All right, so government's defending the counterfactual, a world without organized religion. So again, in our current world as is, we have organized religion. So that'd be Christianity, or Catholicism. That would also be things like Judaism. The different power structures we have kind of flows from top to bottom. We have like a pope, for example, for some religions and stuff like that. So it is very organized. Oppositions defending the status quo. We already have organized religion in our world. Some people follow it, some people don't. Next, this house regrets the rise of cryptocurrency. I brought this example, so this one should be easy. 10 seconds. All right. Governments defending the counterfactual, a world absent of the rise of cryptocurrency. And as I mentioned earlier, it's incredibly important to understand that they are not defending that rise of cryptocurrency was just bad. They're defending a world absent of the rise of cryptocurrency, and that is incredibly important. And opposition defending the status quo, a world with the rise of cryptocurrency. Next, this house supports the rise of social media. I'll give you 10 seconds. So governments defending the status quo, a world that has had a rise of social media. Opposition's actually defending the counterfactual, a world without the rise of social media. Note how tricky this was, because normally you think only the government's defending the counterfactual, because they're going to be the one that are often debating and arguing for some kind of change in terms of the world, or some different way of conceiving it. So government defending the status quo, a world that has had a rise of social media, is because we've already had that happen before. So make sure to account for these tricks. Make sure to account for the fact and consider who is defending what's already happened, the status quo, and who's defending this alternate reality. Opposition is defending the alternate reality. Next, we have this House believes that prominent social society activists, civil society activists, should choose not to run for elected office. In this case, government's defending the counterfactual, a world where prominent civil society activists do not run for elected office, do not choose to not run. Again, in our current reality, which is what opposition is defending, prominent civil society activists sometimes do it, sometimes they don't, but a government is defending a world where they just never do. Note how, again, you do not have to ban them. This is not a policy. You're just imagining they just choose not to do it. So government does not, opposition can't come up here and say arguments about choice and how it's about like giving civil society activists the right to choose about having elected office, because we're just imagining whether a world where they just chose not to do it in the first place through their own will at a mass scale, whether that's a good or bad world. All right, and now we're moving on to the final bucket, bucket number 3, actor motions, which are the most straightforward. Motions that open this house as A would do X are more specific about the entity, which is A, doing an action, which is X. And so it invites a closer examination of the perspective of the entity about what they should do, with all teams arguing from actor A's perspective. So you are now arguing from that perspective of that actor A. Teams debating these motions should therefore consider what actor A's knowledge, values, abilities, and interests are, and explain why the motion is or is not in actor A's best interest. So again, you are taking now the perspective of this actor and explaining why they would want to do whatever action the motion proposes or why they wouldn't want to. So unlike previously discussed, actor debates are not necessarily about whether or not X is best for the world, right? As we noted in a lot, for example, in a lot of the analysis motion buckets, it's about kind of more like a macro view, right? If it's like this house believes that the United States should embargo Russia, it's more about whether the effects of the United States embargoing Russia would be good or bad on a world level. Meanwhile, if it's a motion like this house believes that, this house as United States would embargo Russia, we're only caring about what the United States would want. So, for example, if it affects a country that is, let's just say, like in Southeast Asia or Africa, the United States doesn't care about, then that won't really matter as an implication, unless proven otherwise that that is something the United States does care about, if the embargo has those types of effects. So again, for example, the motion, this house as a parent will not send their child to private school. This debate should take place from the perspective of a parent as both the proposed agent to make a decision about the education of their child and also the proposed target of argumentative appeal. So this is you are taking the perspective of a parent in this motion in order to explain whether they would want to do something like this based on their own interests, but also the judge is you're basically pretend like the judge is a parent in this context. Like you're trying to convince the judge, which is hypothetically a parent, that whether they should or not send their child to private school. And the other motions, you're just trying to convince the judge as like a rational person. You just assume that the judge is their average informed rational person. And this is the only one where you do this. You assume that they are some like whatever the actor that the motion says they are, or the entity. By contrast, if the motion is this house believes that parents should not send their children to private schools, the motion does not take place solely from the perspective of the parent. Instead, the debaters are simply trying to convince the judges of the truth of the statement from a neutral perspective. So whether in general we believe that parents should not send their children to private schools, whether this on aggregate would be good or bad, if we had just no parents do that in general. So in such debates, teams should focus on what the interest of the actor is and which side best fulfills those interests and values. my recommendation for actor motions is to outline at the top of your speeches what you think the different incentives and the different abilities, etc., of this actor is, and then appeal your arguments to that. So let's do our last activity of identifying interests. So firstly, this House, as the United States, would ease the sanctions imposed on Venezuela. Please identify the interests of the actor in the motion, which is the United States. All right. So the interests of the United States as a whole, this is a generalization. One, to avoid economic crisis like a recession. Two, to ensure economic growth. And three, to maintain its position as a leader in promoting democracy. Remember that the country like the United States could have a lot of interests, and that doing the change required by the motion could violate some of those interests, meanwhile support other ones. So it's up to the debaters to decide which of those interests then the United States cares about more. Because presumably it is true that the United States cares about its position as a leader in promoting democracy, and opposition by not easing the sanctions imposed on Venezuela probably supports that goal more because Venezuela is not a democracy. But at the same time, government gets to maybe by easing sanctions imposed on Venezuela, gets access more to maybe oil, which then promotes economic growth. So these interests are contrary, and you have to describe which one is better or which one is more likely to be important to the United States. This House, as a mother, will teach your daughter that there are no good men. All right. So interests of a mother: one, to prepare their child for the real world. Two, to protect their child from harm. Three, to maximize happiness for a child. So these are all different incentives or interests of a mother. So you just got to explain how teaching your daughter that there are no good men is going to affect their daughters and how they perceive men, and how that changes their ability to interact with the real world or maximize happiness or have protection. This House, as a Pope, would abolish the concept of hell. All right, the interests of the Pope. One, to ensure the long-term continuity of the Roman Catholic Church. Two, to stay loyal to the scriptures. Three, to serve God's will. So as you could clearly see, again, the motion could support some of these government while describing these interests. The motion doing so and doing this action, abolishing concept hell, might support some of these interests, but it might also violate other interests. You have to discuss which ones are most important. So that is everything for today's module. We talked about all the different types of motions that you have to know. Doing so before understanding how to debate is important, because now when you see those topics in the upcoming modules, you're going to understand what they mean and how to approach it at a top-down level, what to look for. Make sure to understand and kind of get in the routine of applying the three-step process of approaching a motion, whether it's identifying the type of motion it is, clarifying terms, and also identifying what both sides have to defend. So who's defending the counterfactual, for example, is a great one to think about there. All right, thank you for listening.